All right, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. Happy almost spring. We are very excited to have you here for today's webinar called Changes Afoot, Navigating Cloud Shifts in Higher Ed. We really appreciate you joining today's IAM Online. This is our monthly webinar that is focused on all things identity and access management, and it is brought to you by InCommon and Internet2. For those of you who don't know me, I am Jean Horszewski. I am the InCommon Academy Director, and I am your host today. Just a few housekeeping things as we get started. We're going to have a great session today, and we're really excited about today's presenters. As always, we love it when you ask questions and participate, and we are going to be using the Zoom Q&A function. So if you move your mouse over to the bottom of your Zoom screen, sometimes it's hidden in the three dots, but look for that Q&A function. And if you have some questions, throw them in there, and we'll probably be taking them at the end, so stay tuned for that. If there's anything coming up for you right in the moment, please use the Zoom chat function, and just be sure you select everyone so that everyone can see what you're saying and what you're asking. And many of you always ask, we are recording this webinar, and we will be sharing that on our website as well as the slides, so you can always go back and refer to them later. So stay tuned for that. All right, well, right now I am very happy to pass the virtual mic over to our moderator, Grady Bailey. He is our senior IAM architect at Internet2, and he's going to introduce today's session and our speakers. So Grady, take it away.
Thank you, Jean. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jean mentioned at the top, today we're going to talk largely about the shift, navigating shifts to cloud and SaaS products in higher education identity and access management. Both of our presenters here, Kellen from UVA and Tommy from SMU, have wrangled with this in one way or another, particularly in the area of web single sign-on and moves to Microsoft's Entra ID platform. And while we're largely going to hear about Entra ID today, I truly believe the lessons and considerations that they're going to talk about, the things that they've learned and the suggestions that they have, they can apply to any cloud or SaaS shifts that you may be considering at your own institutions in any aspect of your IAM system. So now I will go ahead and hand it over to Tommy Doan, Identity Management Lead at SMU.
Thank you, Grady. This slide is a shot of the beautiful Dallas Hall on the beautiful Southern Methodist University campus in Dallas, Texas, where it is currently 60 degrees. And just a few cursory things about our campus and about our team. First, the IAM team is a small but motivated team. There are 3 of us. We support approximately 12,000 students, about a 60-40 split undergrad versus grad students, and about 3,500 employees. And meanwhile, we have about 85,000 user accounts. So let's move on to the next slide. What we're looking at here is, and then the next few slides, we'll be looking at some screens that refer to the SSO configuration in our environment before we made changes. So I'm referring to these as the 2024 SSO logon page, for example. So this is the Shibboleth IDP logon page, and that's what we have had as our SSO system since 2013 at SMU. And so this had been a very familiar page. All of our users logging into any SSO integrated application would have seen a screen very much like this up until we made a change at the end of 2024. Let's move on to the next slide. This is an architectural diagram. Largely it was borrowed from a Microsoft diagram, but I made a few enhancements to it. You'll see the key at the lower left corner that shows that the solid blue bars are trust relationships, and that refers to SAML IDP to SP trust. For those perhaps unfamiliar, IDP refers to identity provider. So that would be a SAML identity provider. And SP is a service provider. So you see some examples there with the Shibboleth integration. The Shibboleth IDP has service providers in our data center. So we have lots of data center applications. We also have several SaaS applications that are in the cloud. And we are also federated with the InCommon Federation. And the one pointing to the left is basically the service provider trust that we had with Entra ID. So that one is an interesting one because Shibboleth thinks of it as a service provider, but then on the other side, above the Entra ID icon, you see the trust with Microsoft 365. And from that perspective, Entra ID behaves almost like an identity provider. What that means is if one of our users were to go log on to a Microsoft 365 application, they would be essentially redirected back to IDP to log on. And off the Microsoft 365 application would think that that logon occurred in Entra ID, but it actually occurred in Shibboleth. So I'm hopeful that some of this will be familiar to many of you, but if not, we'll be happy to answer questions about it at the end of the presentation. You also see here that we are very much a Microsoft organization. And so we see a lot of the familiar Microsoft stack on the left. And notably, we have IntraConnect running in our data center that synchronizes objects from Active Directory to Entra ID. And so that is all of our users, groups, and computer objects from Active Directory into the Entra ID. And again, we can answer more questions about that toward the end if we need to. The most important thing I wanted to point out here is, as shown in red, all SSO logons in 2024 and before were handled through the Shibboleth IDP. So let's move on to the next slide. This is a little bit more detail about our environment and about our SSO configuration in 2024. So again, we have Active Directory. We're very fortunate to have a single domain. It's a single force with a single domain, and it is our enterprise directory service. So all users, we have the huge benefit of having all users in that one domain. Again, SSO service was provided by the Shibboleth IDP. We do have Entra, including Entra ID, which formerly was known as Azure Active Directory. And we synchronize objects from Active Directory to Entra ID, and the authentication source for Entra was the Shibboleth IDP. Shibboleth authentication source was Active Directory, and Active Directory was also the attribute resolver. And you see here that we have about 100 local SAML service providers. So those would be ones inside our data center, but about 300 in total that are in use by our user community. So many of those come through the InCommon Federation. One other thing that was not shown in the previous diagram, architecture diagram, is our Duo integration. So I found that a little difficult to include without making it too confusing, but we integrate Cisco Duo directly with our Shibboleth IDP rather than integrating it on a per application basis. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So really we had no problems. Everything was fine. So wanted to talk here a little bit. And it's really all about technology. So we, again, since we're a very Microsoft-focused university, we, in 2003, our IAM team began to realize that in order to move forward with the more modern Microsoft authentication technologies, such as Windows Hello for Business, which you can think of as a collection of Microsoft's passwordless solutions, we needed to also think about onboarding Microsoft Intune, which is not currently in use at our campus. And we found, as we began to look into both of these technologies, that we were unable to make progress with them until we obtained primary refresh tokens, PRTs. And those are issued during SSO logons, and this is not something that Shibboleth was ever designed to do. Plus, we have a general direction toward the Microsoft Cloud and a very gradual transition away from Active Directory. And by the way, we're very interested to make changes toward the cloud on our own schedule rather than on any provider or vendor's schedule, such as the eventual retirement of Active Directory. So that may be, perish the thought, but that may be 20 years away, 50 years away. But we'd like to begin that transition and make the changes on our own schedule. So next slide, please. So our initial discussions about this transition began in summer 2023. Relatively quickly afterward, we initiated a project in spring of 2024. And then our implementation, and I'll discuss some of the details here coming up, occurred just after midnight on December 26th. So that date that we landed on for such a significant change may come as a bit of a surprise, but it was obviously a difficult decision. We heard from lots of constituents around campus, but we decided that in case things did not go well, what would be the time of year and the time on the academic calendar where we could afford to have SSO down with as little impact on the campus as possible. So that kind of directionally put us somewhere in the winter break timeframe. And we also needed to plan for a contingency date so that we could make this work, even if it didn't go as planned initially. And we also needed to staff up our IT help desk during that holiday season. So all of these kind of came together, and we focused on December 26th. Next slide. So a big part of these are 3 points that were really significant parts of our project plan. One was to introduce the Net ID. So at our campus, that was not a term that we were using up until late 2024. So for us, that is the Active Directory user principal name. And that is super important because that is the username that is required by Entra ID for SSO logons. So previous to this, our users always logged in with their SAM account name. And that on our campus is known as the SMU ID number. So in our environment, those are two very different values. And so it was a big part of our communication campaign to brand that user principal name to something. And we chose Net ID so that we could all refer to it and we would all be on the same page about what we're referring to. And then we also configured our Shibboleth IDP to support either of those values for an SSO logon so that users could begin to use the Net ID rather than the SAM account name for logons. And then we gathered and metrics and monitored the adoption rate of our users moving to the Net ID. We also developed in-house a new webpage called the My Profile page. And this is where people could go and see what their Net ID was, just to be 100% certain that they knew what it was. And we also gathered metrics on visits to that page and were able to monitor adoption. And finally, we began what I characterize as a massive communication campaign, and that began in October 2024, so just a few months before the change occurred. And this was primarily to introduce the My Profile page and the Net ID, and also screenshots of what the new SSO logon page would look like. And that would be the Entra ID SSO logon page. So as you see here, more than 100,000 email messages, plus digital displays around campus, social media, et cetera. So it was a really big push on the communication. So on the next slide, we see a screenshot of what the new SSO logon page looks like as of 2025. And that probably looks familiar to other Microsoft universities. So on the next slide, we're showing just an exact duplicate of the original slide that I showed with our original 2024 architecture. We can move on to the next.
Yeah, I will. I'm just noticing that Philip has a question in the chat.
Oh, sure.
That might be hyper sensitive or relevant right here. So any reason you chose tech users, excuse me, about SAM account name instead of showing them how to strip the prefix off user principal name?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, I would just say that if you want to move back a slide or two, one more, there it is. In our environment, maybe I should have shown some examples here, but the user principal name is in no way related to the SAM account name in our environment. They're completely different values. So it was more complex than just adding or removing a suffix. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk in another forum about why that was. Okay, so we move to the next slide, please. Yeah, this is just, again, another look at our 2024 architecture diagram. It's exactly the same as the one that we saw before, but I wanted to insert it here again just for comparison with our new configuration, our new architecture. So if you can move to the next slide, notice that there really aren't many significant differences at the architectural level. So I don't want to minimize the changes that were made. There were lots of technology changes that went into this change. But from an architectural perspective, it's really not that dramatic. And I wanted to highlight that for this audience because as some of you may consider making a change like this, it's not as intimidating as it might seem. And again, this is not going to be a technical presentation. I'm not going to go into any of the technical details about how to make this happen, but I am going to make myself available and others on my team to discuss that with you at another time if you're interested. So the significant things to point out here are, of course, number one, that the SSO logon now comes from Entra ID rather than the Shibboleth IDP. We transitioned the relationship between the IDP and Entra ID from just a SAML service provider to now Shibboleth is behaving as a SAML proxy. And then you'll also see on the arrow, the dotted line between Active Directory and Shibboleth IDP, that Shibboleth no longer performs user authentication at all. The only thing it does now is attribute resolution. So again, there's a lot more that I could say here, but we're going to keep this very high level. And let's move on to the next slide. So this is similar to the previous slide where we talked about some of the details of the environment, but I put in red font the components that were changed. So obviously for our SSO service that had been Shibboleth, now it's Entra ID. Authentication source for Entra ID moved from Shibboleth to now Entra ID itself. And the authentication source for Shibboleth IDP had been Active Directory, but now it comes from the Entra ID through that SAML proxy. And then finally, again, this was sadly not shown in the architectural diagram, but our Duo integration was essentially lifted from the Shibboleth IDP and integrated with Entra ID. And again, kind of keeping this very high level, that was done without having to have our users re-enroll in Duo. So that was a very important component of the project plan. So next slide, I'm going to wrap up my presentation with a few references to some technical documentation where you can learn more about what we did And I want to take just a moment to offer a huge thank you to Chris Phillips, who put together the SAML proxy with Shibboleth documentation, which is linked there at the top of the screen. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Grady.
Thank you, Tommy. That was really excellent. I hope everyone is already learning quite a bit about how to navigate these sorts of shifts at their own institutions. A reminder, if you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A feature. We are going to have a significant Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. For now, I'm going to go ahead and pass the microphone over to Kellen, who at UVA has been considering these sorts of changes and is on the road to doing the sort of work that Tommy described. Go ahead, Kellen.
Thanks, Grady. Yeah, so at the University of Virginia, next slide, please. Things are ever so slightly more complicated than at SMU, and that might be perhaps a bit of an understatement. First, I want to say about our team, or rather teams, as it were. The identity services team is split in two. There's an engineering and architecture, which I'm the only architect, so I felt free to leave architecture off, and an operations team. And the operations team, obviously engineering is engineering. The operations team is focused on primarily like business analysts, business analysis. They are also the higher level of support as things come in from our help desk, which we refer to as access management. It's actually under a separate division within ITS where all of our support services flow. But our team was primarily an application team for a number of years. We ran our identity governance and administration platform, which is Fisher Identity. When I joined, it was right at the beginning of that fact changing at UVA. And so I was brought in to assist with rolling out Grouper as a replacement for a legacy group solution. And many of you know me through my engagement with the Internet 2 community, primarily through talking about Grouper. Recently, we've actually also taken over our university's deployment of Shibboleth. Shibboleth at UVA was previously ran by our enterprise storage team for a number of reasons. Mostly, that team used to be a single team called the Linux team. And Shibboleth was an application that ran in Linux, so it lived with them. And then those teams evolved as ITS evolved. That, as of February, is now in our bailiwick. And, you know, as a person with a deep love of Shibboleth, I'm very excited about that. But it, you know, we have a situation here where we have Shibboleth and Entra and need to do something about it. We are a bit bigger than SMU. We've got a system where when you are granted a net ID, you are granted an identity. We always keep that identity. So as a result, we have 1.2 million total identities in our identity management system. That equates to around 30,000 students, 30,000 faculty and staff, and other, because we do actually have 19 different primary roles. So we've got some grace roles, we've got alumni, et cetera, tons of roles. That larger system then is reflected in the fact that our authentication system, next slide, Gene, please, is a little bit more robust. So for, next slide, please. There we go. So for Shibboleth, we have branded that as NetBadge. NetBadge on grounds, sorry, you can't say on campus at UVA, you have to say on grounds. NetBadge is the primary authentication mode. Most of our major applications, Workday HR, Zoom, where we're at now, our PeopleSoft Sys, Canvas, LMS, et cetera, all of that stuff mostly goes through NetBadge, and NetBadge has been around for a very long time. Because of our distributed, decentralized environment, though, it's quite complex to do authentication. So for instance, we have 3 different authentication sources defined. One of those is what we call IAM LDAP. And this is a single LDAP, open LDAP instance that we spun up alongside Fisher when we deployed that. And it really only stores the user's computing ID and password. And that lives as the primary authentication source for UVA. If a user falls through that, for some reason they don't authenticate against that, or that's down, right? The next thing that they fall through to is our Active Directory, which is termed eServices Active Directory. So if you hear me say eServices, I mean AD. That has all of the identity information for most of our active university, directly with the university affiliated roles. So faculty, staff, etc. Roles like alumni are not in AD. Additionally, we have a third authentication source, which is the UVA Health, the hospital system. The result of that, those three authentication sources, is that you never know where someone's actually authenticating. We actually had a situation where Shibboleth wasn't able to talk to IAM LDAP, and we didn't notice it right away because we were only seeing failures for alumni, right? Because they're not in either of the two systems. So it took us a little while to find. We do use Duo, but the moral of the story with Shibboleth is it's very mature. It's got a lot of history, and the integration process is very smooth. Integration requests flow through our ServiceNow instance, which is very nicely set up. Every single SAML integration that's built with NetBadge or Shibboleth will have a ServiceNow CI attached to it. Technically, it has two ServiceNow configuration items. It has one that's the internal technical reference, and then one that's sort of the administrative. Who is the contact on campus for this entity? Who do we need to contact? The metadata will live there and things like that. And when you open a ticket in ServiceNow to create a NetBadge integration, it's usually very smooth because we ask a lot of pointed, direct questions, right? Okay, so that's Shibboleth. But at the same time at UVA, we also have Entra. Next slide, please. And Entra is really becoming the more typical place to approach these things. One of the things about, and I actually made a typo on this slide. I said SAML integrations. It's not just SAML, because most of the things I think that are in our Entra are actually our OAuth 2 or OpenID Connect integrations. What has happened historically is we have not deployed the OIDC components, the plugins for Shibboleth. We've just said, oh, your application needs OIDC. Let's go build that in Entra, right? The main application, though, obviously, is just like with SMU, Office 365. Everyone uses Office 365. Faculty, staff, students, right? And that's native to the Entra login. Our Entra ID is synced with Entra Connect to our Active Directory on-prem. But that poses a challenge because it's really just that one authentication source of the identities that are synced from AD up into Entra. So now we have a problem when it comes to, well, let's say we have an application that we need to expose to alumni or emeriti or applicants or something like that that's not surfaced into Active Directory. Those only exist in IAM LDAP. Now we can't use these Entra integrations. We have to go through Shibboleth. So that's one of the challenges. The other thing about Azure, and I'm going to do that a lot because to me, this is all still Azure AD, but the thing about Entra is we kind of started using it internally for a lot of things because of that OpenID requirement and because, oh, hey, it's handy, you know, a couple of clicks and you've built the Splunk integration or the Logic Monitor integration or something internal to ITS. And what's happened is there's this now hodgepodge of 600 or so integrations that it's not necessarily clear what all of them are, who owns them. We might be able to infer something from like the group that has access to authenticate through that, but there's not like a nice list of all of the integrations surfaced into ServiceNow like there is for Shibboleth. It's also not clear necessarily that the governance is set for these things. We've done it ad hoc over the years. We don't have sort of like a clear unified governance model yet. Whereas for like our NetBadge integrations, we have nice documentation of like, hey, these are the attributes you can get. Anything else is a special request and requires yada, 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 right? Okay, thanks, Grady. So that's kind of, where we're at. We have these two completely separate systems. Next slide, please. Okay, so where are we going, right? That is the big question. There is a bit of a perception in, I think, the broader community, and I'm not saying that this is my perception or that I agree with it, but maybe that Shibboleth is a legacy platform. There's a lot of move towards the new stuff, and that new stuff for us is Entra. We're using it. There is a, whoops, sorry. There is a very real view in the community that Shib is maybe legacy. And what are we going to do? Well, UVA is in a position where we've got this new identity team, and we're building this out. We've just taken over NetBadge. We're well positioned to ask the question of what is the solution or solutions that are right for UVA long term. Next slide, please. So broadly speaking, I think we got 4 options, right? We can go all in on Shib. We can go all in on Entra. We can do some sort of hybrid approach, or question mark, what else, right? So next slide, laying all the cards on the table. Realistically, going all in on Shibboleth is just not happening. We have 600 integrations already in Entra ID. It's too deeply embedded. It's too critical. Too many people like it, and frankly, there are too many things for us to say we're just not going to use this. We're gonna pivot entirely. On the other hand, could we go all in on Entra ID? And I think the answer to that is potentially yes. Next slide, please. So there are some key things that we sort of have to figure out. Number one, how do we handle multilateral federation? Because of our SAML integrations in NetBadge, many of them are in common. Right away, this leads itself to taking a hybrid approach rather than going all in, because the official recommendation as of the last that I saw it from Microsoft Entra was to use Shib or something else, like buying Cirrus Bridge and using that to sort of replace the multilateral federation component that's provided now by Entra, by Shibboleth. So what else about going all in? Well, big deal. It's going to take a ton of time for us to try and migrate every single integration from Shibboleth to Entra ID. That's hundreds of integrations that are functioning now, work just fine, that we're going to effectively break just to make this change. Difficult questions have to be asked there. And I think most important is the big blocker for going all in on Entra ID and just replacing it as our primary IDP is, what about the users that need to sign into applications that are not surfaced currently in Azure AD? We do have alumni that authenticate against Shibboleth every single day. That's a big issue. And then governance. Governance needs to be unified. There's no clear governance structure. I don't want to say there's no governance, because there is governance, but it's not formalized. So what do we do there with Entra ID? All of this, I think, adds up strongly to taking the hybrid approach. Next slide, please. Which is effectively what Tommy was starting with and moved to. Pick one of the IDPs, and that's the primary, and you proxy the other one, right? So which one, right? If we choose Entra as our primary IDP, we still have substantial problems, because what do you do about those users that are not surfaced as identities in Entra ID? Do you do something complex like a discovery scenario that happens at the interstitial Shibboleth layer? Do you take the other approach, which is where I think Tommy at SMU started, which was take Shibboleth and have Entra be a service provider to Shibboleth? I think that's the approach that we're probably headed towards. That avoids a lot of the challenges of user surfacing, that avoids the challenges of migrating all the entities. That's not to say we won't migrate some of the entities. And there might be a compelling reason for us to spend a bunch of time to think about, because of governance, spinning up OpenID Connect's plugins on Shibboleth and building out some rules and some policies about what actually gets built directly in Entra, what gets built in Shibboleth. So a very hard, complex problem, a lot to think about. Next slide, please. And then there's something else entirely, right? I already sort of hinted at complex proxy. Some of the things here, we use step-up authentication in our Workday HR system for sensitive actions like related to payroll and things like that. How do we handle that? Certificate authentication is extremely popular at UVA. I don't even think I could remember my full normal LDAP password because I sign in with my password manager and my certificate all the time. So we have to make sure we make certificate support built in nicely into whatever primary IDP we use, whatever our primary authentication source is. And then you have to ask the question, do we just keep them separated? That's a hint for those that like that song. We could just approach this from, well, let's figure out governance for Entra. Let's figure out what we need to do there to bring that more in line with like a ServiceNow pipeline to build SAML integrations for NetBadge. That allows us to choose, authentication scenarios that are relying party specific as their needs dictate. We can always sort of keep ourselves in this scenario for a time and do a slow move into Entra. Is a truly unified single sign-on solution something that we really need? And then that's where we can also explore and experiment and say, well, we want to start leveraging some of the advanced stuff from Entra. Let's do it. Lastly, there are other players in this space. There's Ping, there's Okta, there's Auth0, although I think they may have been bought by Okta. There's stuff that we can do that's not either of these. Are those even worth considering? What does that look like? So next slide. I'll wrap this up for questions, but what is the advice that I can give? We're early. I don't know, but this is a very complex scenario. And it's a complex scenario that I think is probably very common. Large universities, distributed campuses. If you think about the number of times departments spin up IDPs or they got an Azure tenant, and you got an Azure tenant, and you got an Azure tenant, we have to figure out how to make all these things work in a unified scenario. It's complex. So what I think that the university can do here is, we want to share our journey. And I don't know what form that takes exactly, other than talking in forums like this and at working groups and maybe contributing some community contributions to various wikis or things like that. But if you think about this from the 0th position that we're in, which is we've got both today, they're kind of completely separate. What do we want to do? There's just a ton of stuff to balance. Federation participation and time and money cost are our key considerations. We want to keep participating in federations because we do it a lot. We're very active in the community, but we have the very real reality of, hey, the SHIB infrastructure costs us a lot of money. It's really robust, but that comes at a cost. We've also got a balance of, one of the things we want to get is improved reliability, where we're not dependent on this thing that's on grounds for you to log into your whatever email, for instance. We wouldn't want to introduce a dependency on a non-cloud environment for a completely cloud service as it is today. We got to maintain also stuff like, well, how do we actually improve our security posture? Or do we improve our security posture? How do we maintain compliance? And what are the requirements there that we have to think about, especially when it comes to the governance stuff? And then finally, I think you have friction whenever you make any sort of change. So I think when we go and say we were to proxy SHIB to Entra, and now everybody sees the Entra screen as their main screen, that's going to cause some friction, or vice versa. They're used to seeing the Azure screen when they sign in to their email, and now they're seeing NetBadge, and there's confusion there. So all of this sort of stuff, I think, comes into the calculus, and I'm a former physicist, so it's a massively complex optimization problem that makes me happy. But it's because it's fun to work on, but it's also very difficult. So that's what I think that where we're at, and I hand it back to Grady. I think let's talk.
Thanks, Kellen. So I want to call attention real quick to the Q&A window, in which Tommy has been extremely active there, as well as in the chat, answering folks' questions by way of text. But I do want to highlight a couple that I thought I saw multiple people ask about. So real quick, I want to start off by asking about MFA strategy. Tommy, I know you mentioned that you have Duo and it wasn't shown on the diagram, and you've kind of explained in some of your chat messages and answers. Kellen, have you, I'd like to get a thought about MFA as it pertains to a move from Shibboleth and to Entra, what that decision making and thought process looks like to both of you.
Yeah, I'll just say that MFA device enrollment is obviously user inconvenience, put it that way, and that transition to Microsoft MFA will be a conversation that we have. We just did not want to make it a part of this project. There's enough user impact as it is with the change that we did, so we just wanted to scope it down.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, we're still early on in the process, but I think whatever change happens, we'll continue to keep Duo so long as Duo remains affordable. Really, it comes down to what Cisco does with the pricing for Duo, and that'll be the change. So if they decide to make the call and double our Duo costs, I guarantee we'll be looking seriously at MSMFA just because of the cost element. But I think trying to do that at the same time would just add more user headache that we want to avoid.
Thanks. I saw also a couple of other questions that were related to, and we can kind of wrap this up in a question about what getting everyone on board for this sort of move at your institution, and from leadership down to specifically help desk staff and IT staff, support staff, because there were questions around how much work was it going to be to transition integrations or fielding calls when you made a switch like this. So I'd like to give you each a little bit of time to talk about what these sorts of shifts mean in terms of not user impact, but your staffing impact, your people behind the scenes impact. Kellen, what have you considered around that? And Tommy, what were the very real impacts in terms of what you had to do or are having to do differently?
So for us, when we're looking at this and looking at the calculus of this decision, right, we have to consider the fact that in this initial switchover, we are going to have a flood of help desk stuff if we change. And our help desk already gets a lot of net badge tickets. So we're kind of blessed in that we're well staffed to handle it. But it's certainly going to affect timing of the switchover. That's going to be delicate. It's definitely going to switch. We're going to have to prepare a substantial amount of training materials, because as it stands today, users pretty much see one error from Shib, and the help desk staff is really good at knowing, okay, that's a you problem or that's not a you problem, and handling it accordingly. The error messages you get from Entra are a little more nuanced and can be a little more scary if someone clicks that show extra details button. And so I think there's going to be some training that we're going to have to do, and that's going to have to be budgeted. And that's all that's going to do is extend the timeline on this. This is not going to be a quick thing.
Yeah, I would say for us, the decision was based primarily on our desire to move toward passwordless solutions. And we think that's going to be a huge boon for the user community as far as a convenience. we were having this conversation recently. There aren't many technologies where you benefit both in security and user convenience, but passwordless is one of those. And we just think it's going to be wildly successful. We've not really announced that to the campus. So if anyone from SMU is listening, please don't jump too quickly. But that is the strategy, the direction that we're heading. So we see it as kind of taking care of some prerequisites so we can move in that direction. By the way, there have been some user convenience enhancements just by the move to Entra ID and getting that PRT token that I referred to, because there are far less authentication prompts now. So essentially you log into your workstation, you get that PRT. Now, at least if you're using the Microsoft browser, you can get into SSO integrated apps, even if they're Shibboleth integrated apps, without another logon prompt. So I would just say that we're motivated by user convenience and especially also by security. And when we can achieve both, we're definitely doing it.
Excellent. So there were a couple of questions that I saw. Some dig into a little bit more of the technical sides of things in terms of issues with SAML tokens, login issues with Microsoft's thick clients. Those are both open questions right now from Philip and Clay. And then I also saw another question around, why use something like Shibboleth instead of the Cirrus Bridge or some other sort of proxy? Can we try and wrap a bunch of SAML things all into one little bit of discussion here?
I would just characterize our position as SMU has been a Shibboleth consortium member from the beginning. As soon as the consortium was formed, we were happy to participate, and we plan to continue that. So I definitely want to emphasize that we are not motivated to move away from Shibboleth. It's an integral part of our environment, and it will continue to be so. Users don't see that logon, the Shibboleth IDP logon screen any longer because it's not doing authentication, but it's still there, and we plan to keep it there.
So I know there was a question about SAML and specific to logout, and I have thoughts there. So logout's really hard with SAML, and SLO, the single logout, global logout, it's almost impossible to achieve in my mind. So I don't think I'm worried too much that like a SAML logout for Microsoft is a SAML logout, because we officially don't support SAML logout with our Shibboleth IDP, just because of the way service providers fail to handle that. My hope is actually that by proxying up, and if Entra were to be made our primary IDP, that global logout behavior I actually like. I think you make people sign out, they sign out. If they have to sign it again, they're going to be so used to seeing it. We need to make that authentication process seamless and easy. And that's where like passwordless might come in, that it's okay. So that's the one thought I had on SAML.
So actually continuing down sort of the technical side of things, how do you factor in being able to get some sort of technical support or assistance, fixing a technical problem when you're talking about moving to a SaaS platform or a cloud platform, opposed to something that you're running internally, that you have all the, you can modify the bits and pieces on? What sort of weight does the reality of you might be at the mercy of Microsoft to fix some sort of bug, what sort of weight does that carry when you're in these positions, implementing these things, or you're working to look at moving to those different solutions?
I'll just say quickly that we're big proponents of put a lot of time and energy into testing and early adoption before the change. Because if you don't do that, at least in my experience, you end up spending probably twice as much time and energy, plus heartbreak and user disruption. So I didn't speak about it during our slides, but the Microsoft password hash sync for SSO has a sort of an early adoption feature that we took full advantage of. And we've made that available to anyone and everyone that would participate, and helped us tremendously. So I guess what I'm saying, Grady, is we try to avoid those support calls as much as possible by testing an early adoption.
So I think, again, this is where the size of our organization blesses us a little bit. Leadership at UVA is very keen to have official support channels. And while I'm a huge advocate of open source and you know, we'll bug Scott on the official SHIB consortium Slack if we have a problem with NetBadge, leadership actually sees it sort of as an advantage. I think that there is Microsoft behind this thing. It's massive, it's huge. If we're having this issue, lots of people are having the issue most likely. And frankly, Microsoft's been a great partner with us in replying to things. It might take some time, but I think it's viewed as a good thing generally. Now, that is my UVA, I think, answer. There's my personal answer too, as Kellen, who is a huge proponent of open source, and I see Shibboleth as being super solid because we've all contributed things to it, and we've all embraced it, and it's open, and I love it. I realistically think that there will be a hybrid scenario at UVA. I just don't see us ever moving completely away from Shibboleth, because we have so many integrations that just work, and they work because of in common in the community. But at the same time,
what a great transition, Kellen.
Yeah.
So we've got just, I want to get 30 seconds from each of you on what do you think that as you shift, if you shift away from, from Shibboleth or, as you adopt more cloud things, it's a little bit different, your role in contributing to the community, the in common community, and what you can get out of it. What do you see as your contributions to the community and what you can get out of it? Just give me a quick, again, 15 seconds maybe.
Yeah,
Okay.
participate in webinars like this, and make ourselves available. I didn't put my contact information in, but hopefully you guys will make that available. We're happy to have a conversation with others.
Absolutely. Engage with the community, engage with this forum. I don't know what the community wants, but I think that everyone is sort of dealing with this problem of what are we doing about these cloud providers, whether it's Entra or anything else, and how do we handle that with our existing stuff? And so I'm open to participating however the community thinks we should be participating.
All right. Thank you so much. I think that is all the time we had for Q&A, and I'm going to hand it back to Jean to kind of wrap us up.
Yeah, well, I want to keep on that thread, Kellen, because if this topic is resonating with you, if you all are going through these similar decisions or confusions, or maybe you've even solved some of these things, we want to know if you want to keep going. Obviously, this is just one webinar and it's mostly unidirectional, but we're interested to know if you want to keep going with this conversation. Both Kellen and Tommy have let us know that they would be willing to participate in something else if we want to keep the conversation going. So I just want to alert you, I'm going to share my screen again. If you do want to, and it's loading, carry on. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. If you do want to carry on, we have a little survey. So when you leave today, and don't leave yet, but when you leave today, you're going to be prompted with a little pop-up survey, and it's going to ask you a couple questions. But one of the questions is, what else do you want? What other kind of thing might you be interested in after today's webinar? And if there's something that you do want to do, also drop us in that form your contact information. And so if we spin something else up, we can let you know for sure. So I just want to wrap up today and just say many thanks to Kellen, Tommy, and Grady. Wow, really what a rich conversation. And I know this one's a hot topic and we hear it in many different channels as well. Thank you to all of you who've jumped in and asked questions and are interested Before we sign off, just a couple of reminders. You know, Kellen and Tommy mentioned about participating with community. If you want to get connected to community, if you want your team to be more connected, Basecamp 2025 is right around the corner. This is our 5-day virtual event. Lots of fun, lots of learning. So if you have new team members or even existing team members who want to brush up on IAM and also just get more connected and feel like you're not alone, sign up here. We are having our buy two, get one free promotion again, so bring your whole team. We talked a lot about Shib today, but there's other tap components, and just keep your eye out on the In Common website because we're going to be launching some more trainings later this spring. We have a new midpoint training as well as some grouper stuff, and Shib will be coming up a little bit later in September. That top little bullet point here, that's the survey that we're talking about. If you want to do something more after today, make sure you fill that out and let us know. If you have ideas about an IAM online, let us know that too. You can drop me a note, or if you have other ideas about what you want to see or hear. Next month, April 16th, if you are thinking about or are interested in how might you be strategizing for cross-institutional course sharing, we have the webinar for you. We have a lot going on with a consortia called IDEA, and we're putting together a toolkit. But next month's webinar is all about what we're doing with this consortia. And we hope you'll tune in. So please do register. Remember, we have to register for every one of our webinars now. So I think that is it for today. We sure do appreciate you joining us. Again, we will be sending out a link to let you know that this recording and slides have been posted. But do feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. Special thanks to Jennifer and the rest of the Internet 2 team who make this monthly event happen. So again, Kellen, Tommy, Grady, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great day, and we will see you next month.